The wine was cheap, and the dating app conversation was cheaper, and Eleanor Fairfax had officially reached the point where sending a provocative text to a stranger seemed like a perfectly reasonable idea. She sat cross-legged on her worn couch in her cramped apartment, the glow of her phone screen illuminating her flushed cheeks as she typed and deleted and typed again. The guy from the app, Marcus something, had been flirting with her for 3 days now, all suggestions and innuendo that made her feel reckless in a way her ordinary life never allowed. She was 26 and tired of being careful, tired of budgeting every dollar and turning down invitations because she had a deadline, tired of being the responsible one who always played it safe. So she typed out the text, explicit and bold, and nothing like the messages she usually sent. Her heart hammering with liquid courage and frustration. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The rush lasted exactly 4 seconds before her stomach dropped. The name at the top of the screen was not Marcus. It was not anyone she recognized. The number sat there, unfamiliar and damning, and her wine glass nearly slipped from her trembling fingers. She had somehow messaged a completely wrong number with words that made her face burn even reading them back. Autocorrect had changed the contact name, or she had scrolled wrong, or the universe had decided tonight was the night to punish her for every cautious decision she had ever made by making her spectacularly humiliate herself to a stranger. She typed frantically, apologies tumbling over each other, explaining the mistake with increasingly desperate clarity. Her phone buzzed before she finished the third message. The response was not what she expected. It was an address. The Sinclair Tower, penthouse. Midnight. Nothing else. No laughter, no disgust, no reassurance that they would both forget this mortifying accident. Just an address and a time. Eleanor stared at the screen, her pulse loud in her ears. She knew that building. Everyone in the city knew that building. It was the tallest, most expensive piece of real estate downtown, all black glass and sharp edges that cut into the skyline like a blade. She Googled the address with shaking hands and felt her throat tighten. The penthouse was worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. Who had she accidentally propositioned? She typed back quickly, saying she could not come, that this was a mistake, that she was sorry. The reply came faster this time. I will be waiting, or I will come to you. The choice is yours. Her blood turned cold. This was not a joke. Whoever this was had taken her message seriously and expected her to follow through, and the alternative he offered was somehow more terrifying than showing up at a stranger's penthouse at midnight. She looked around her small apartment, the locks that were barely functional, the ground floor window that faced the street. He had her number. If he wanted her address, he could find it. She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? She had sent explicit messages, and now the recipient wanted to meet? They would laugh, or worse, think she was wasting their time. The clock on her phone read 9:47. She had just over 2 hours to decide if she was going to face this mistake on his territory or wait for him to bring it to her door. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Eleanor spent the next 2 hours convincing herself she would not go to that penthouse, that she would stay in her apartment with the door locked and ignore whatever came next. But even as she made those promises to herself, she knew they were lies built on sand. She tried Googling the phone number again with different search terms and found nothing, tried reverse lookup services that yielded no results, and the blank anonymity of it made her stomach clench with anxiety that tasted like metal on her tongue. She poured the rest of the wine down the sink because she needed to think clearly, needed to make a decision that was not soaked in bad judgment and loneliness. At 11:43, she was pacing her small living room, wearing a path in the already worn carpet, her phone clutched in her hand like a talisman that had already failed to protect her. At 11:51, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door, slow and deliberate, and her entire body went rigid with the kind of fear that makes you forget how to breathe. The doorbell rang at exactly midnight. Not a knock, but the bell, polite and patient, as if he had all the time in the world and knew she was on the other side deciding whether to open the door or call for help that probably would not come in time. Eleanor moved to the peephole on legs that felt disconnected from her body, her heart a wild thing trying to escape her chest. Through the small glass circle she saw him. The man stood in the hallway light looking like he had stepped out of a world entirely separate from her own, wearing a black coat that probably cost more than her rent, tailored so perfectly it seemed like a second skin. His hair was dark and styled with careless precision, and his face was all sharp angles and strong lines, the kind of face that would make you look twice on the street before you remembered it was safer not to stare. He was looking directly at the peephole as if he could see her seeing him, and something about his stillness was more unnerving than if he had been pounding on the door. Her hands shook as she pressed against the wood, her voice barely working when she managed to speak. "Who are you?" Not a question, because she was too frightened for it to sound like one. His voice came through the door, smooth and calm, the kind of voice that made you want to listen even when your instincts screamed to run. "Alexander Sinclair. You sent me a very interesting message tonight, Eleanor. I came to tell you I appreciated it." Hearing her name in his mouth made her knees weak. "How did you know where I live?" A pause, and she could almost hear the smile in his voice when he answered. "You are not difficult to find. I wanted to discuss making those words you sent a reality." "This is not what you think," she said, hating how her voice trembled, hating that he was here, and she was trapped between the fear of opening the door and the greater fear of what he might do if she did not. "It was a mistake, wrong number. I thought I was texting someone else." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know. That makes it even more intriguing. Open the door, Eleanor. Let me see the woman who writes such promises to strangers." She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him to leave and never come back. But something in his tone made her hands move to the chain lock before her mind caught up. She opened the door just enough for the chain to catch, a 3-inch gap that felt like the only barrier between her old life and whatever came next. Through that narrow space she saw his eyes for the first time, pale and sharp and absolutely focused on her face with an intensity that made her forget the explanation she had prepared. He was smiling at her through the gap in the door, a small expression that somehow made him more dangerous rather than less. And Eleanor realized with a start that he was amused by her terror, not in a cruel way, but as if he found the entire situation entertaining in a way she could not begin to understand. "You really did mean to send that to someone else," he said, and it was not a question but an observation delivered with something that sounded almost like disappointment. "I did," she managed, her voice steadier now that she could see he was not actively trying to break down her door. "I am so sorry. It was a stupid mistake and I have been mortified for the past 2 hours." He tilted his head slightly, studying her through the narrow opening with those unsettling pale eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her face. "May I come in, Eleanor?" "Just to talk. I promise I am not here to make you uncomfortable." The request was polite, almost formal, but she shook her head immediately because letting this stranger into her apartment felt like crossing a line she could not uncross. "No, I do not think that is a good idea." He accepted the refusal without argument, simply nodding once and then leaning his shoulder against the doorframe as if settling in for a longer conversation. "That is wise of you. You do not know me, but I would like to remedy that if you will allow it." She should have closed the door, should have told him to leave and locked every lock she had, but instead, she found herself standing there with her hand on the chain and her heart still racing as he asked her about herself with the casual ease of someone making small talk at a party rather than standing in a dingy hallway at midnight. "What do you do, Eleanor Fairfax?" "Graphic design," she answered before she could stop herself. "Freelance." "How did you know my last name?" "The same way I found your address." It was not difficult. He said it without threat, just simple fact, and somehow that made it worse. You have a sister, Caroline, younger by 3 years. You grew up on the East Side. You studied art at the community college and started your business 2 years ago. He recited the details of her life like reading from a file, and she felt her stomach drop, because he had clearly looked into her with a thoroughness that spoke of resources she could not begin to match. "Why are you here?" she asked, needing to understand what he wanted beyond the obvious, beyond the message she had sent. "Because your text was the most interesting thing to happen to me in a very long time," he said, and the honesty in his voice caught her off guard. "Because you clearly did not mean to send it to me, which makes it even more intriguing. Because I wanted to see the woman who writes such things when she thinks no one important is watching." They talked for 20 minutes through that cracked door, his questions drawing out answers she had no business giving, and she found herself relaxing despite every instinct screaming that this man was dangerous in ways she did not fully comprehend. He told her nothing about himself except his name, but he listened to her talk about her work and her frustrations with dating apps and the loneliness of living in a city full of people who never truly saw you, and his attention felt like a physical thing, focused and absolute. Finally, he straightened from the doorframe and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small black card that he slipped through the gap in the door. "If you ever want to make good on that accidental promise, call me," he said. "Or if you just want to talk again. Either way, Eleanor, it was a pleasure to meet you." He turned and walked away down the hallway before she could respond, his footsteps fading into silence that felt louder than his presence had been. She closed the door and locked it with shaking hands, staring down at the card with his name and a single phone number embossed in silver. She should have torn it up, thrown it away, forgotten this entire humiliating night. Instead, she set it carefully on her kitchen counter where she would see it every morning, a reminder of the stranger who had shown up at midnight and made her feel seen in a way that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. 3 days passed in a strange liminal space, where Eleanor tried to convince herself that the midnight visit had been some kind of fever dream, that Alexander Sinclair was not real, and the card on her counter was just a hallucination born of loneliness and too much wine. But every time she looked at that black rectangle with its silver lettering, she knew the truth lived in her apartment like a second presence. She threw herself into work, took on 2 new clients she did not have time for, and spent Wednesday evening at the coffee shop near the waterfront district, finishing mock-ups that were due the next morning, her laptop screen glowing in the dimming light as the autumn sun bled orange across the horizon. At 7:30, she looked up to rest her eyes and saw him across the street. Alexander Sinclair, unmistakable even at a distance, walking toward the entrance of Marcello's, an Italian restaurant she had always thought looked too expensive for anyone who actually lived in this neighborhood, and he was with 2 other men in dark suits who moved with the same predatory grace he did. Eleanor told herself to look away, to focus on her work, and forget she had seen him, but curiosity was a living thing crawling under her skin, whispering that she might never get another chance to understand who he really was. She saved her work, closed her laptop, and followed. The street was busy enough that she could trail behind at a safe distance, just another woman walking home in the early evening, and she watched as Alexander and his companions entered the restaurant and were led toward the back where large windows overlooked the street. She positioned herself across the road behind a newspaper stand, feeling ridiculous and reckless in equal measure, her heart pounding with the guilty thrill of spying on someone who had invaded her life without permission. Through the glass, she could see them seated at a corner table, and then a third man joined them, older and heavier, his face flushed with anger even from this distance. The meeting looked tense from the start, Alexander sitting perfectly still while the older man gestured aggressively, his mouth moving in what was clearly a tirade. One of Alexander's companions stood abruptly, and the older man's hand disappeared into his jacket, emerging with something dark and metallic that Eleanor's brain registered as a gun half a second before Alexander moved. It happened so fast she almost missed it, A blur of motion as Alexander twisted sideways and grabbed the man's wrist, forcing the weapon down toward the table, while his other hand struck with surgical precision at the man's throat. Eleanor gasped, the sound loud in her own ears, and one of the men at the table turned and looked directly at her through the window, his eyes locking onto hers with the focused attention of a predator spotting prey. She ran. Her laptop bag banged against her hip as she bolted down the sidewalk, pushing past startled pedestrians, her breath coming in panicked gasps as she heard footsteps behind her, heavy and fast and getting closer. She turned into an alley, a desperate choice born of terror, and realized her mistake when the narrow passage stretched ahead with no exits visible. A hand grabbed her arm and she opened her mouth to scream when another hand covered it and she was pulled backward into a doorway, her back hitting a solid chest as a familiar voice spoke low and urgent against her ear. "Do not make a sound," Alexander said, and she froze as two men ran past their hiding spot, their footsteps echoing off brick walls before fading into the distance. He kept her there for another 30 seconds, his body shielding hers, his hand still over her mouth, and when he finally released her and turned her to face him, his pale eyes were blazing with something between fury and fear. "What were you thinking, Eleanor? You just made a very dangerous mistake." Alexander did not give her a choice about leaving the alley, his hand firm on her elbow as he guided her through a series of back streets she did not recognize, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every shadow and exit in this part of the city, and Eleanor's mind was still trying to process what she had seen through that restaurant window, the casual violence, the gun, the way he had moved, like violence was a language he spoke fluently. They emerged onto a quiet street where a black car waited, engine running, and he opened the back door and helped her inside with a gentleness that contradicted the tension radiating from his body. The driver did not speak, did not even look at her, just pulled away from the curb as Alexander slid in beside her and made a phone call in a voice too low for her to hear. The apartment he took her to was in a building she had never noticed before, its entrance unmarked and its lobby empty except for a security desk where a man in a suit nodded at Alexander without question, and the elevator required a key card that Alexander produced from his pocket before pressing the button for the 12th floor. The silence between them was suffocating. When the elevator doors opened directly into the apartment, Eleanor stepped out onto marble floors and saw floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, art on the walls that was probably worth more than she made in a year. "This is a safe house," Alexander said, closing the door and engaging 3 separate locks. "You will stay here until I can ensure the Moretti family understands you are not a threat to them." She turned on him then, anger finally breaking through the shock. "What are you talking about? I am going home. I did not ask to be part of whatever that was back there." "You followed me," he said, and his voice was calm, but she heard the edge beneath it. "You witnessed a meeting with one of the most dangerous crime families in this city. They saw you. They will assume you are connected to me, that you might have information they can use." Eleanor laughed, a sharp sound with no humor in it. "This is insane. I am calling the police." "Be my guest," he said, pulling out his phone and holding it out to her. "Tell them you were spying on a private meeting and saw something you should not have. See how protected you feel when they take your statement and then send you home to your apartment where Marco Moretti's soldiers are already waiting." He swiped to his photos and turned the screen toward her. And Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. The image showed her apartment building, the familiar red brick and the corner store on the ground floor, and standing on the sidewalk near her entrance were 2 men in dark jackets, their posture alert and watchful. The photo was time-stamped 20 minutes ago. "How?" she started, but her voice failed. "I have people watching your building the moment I realized you were following me," Alexander said, pocketing his phone. "I knew there was a chance the Morettis would move fast." "They did. Those men have been there for 15 minutes. They are waiting for you to come home." Eleanor sat down on the nearest chair because her legs would not hold her anymore. her hands shaking as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. This could not be happening. This was not her life. I need you to understand something, Alexander said, and he crouched in front of her so they were eye level, his pale gaze holding hers with an intensity that demanded attention. I can protect you, but only if you cooperate. Stay here where I can guarantee your safety. Let me handle the Morettis. When this is resolved, you can go back to your life. What choice do I have? Eleanor whispered. None, he said, and the honesty was almost worse than a lie would have been. I am sorry for that. But I will keep you alive. She looked at him, this stranger who had walked into her life 3 days ago and turned everything upside down, and nodded because survival was not really a choice at all. The safe house was beautiful in the way a museum is beautiful, perfect and untouchable and utterly soulless. And Eleanor spent the first hour after Alexander left, walking from room to room, like a ghost haunting someone else's life, her fingers trailing over furniture she was afraid to sit on, and artwork that probably cost more than her annual income. The kitchen had a coffee maker she did not know how to operate, the bathroom had a shower with controls like a spaceship, and the bedroom had a bed big enough for 4 people that made her feel small and lost when she finally sat on its edge and let herself acknowledge the full weight of her situation. She was trapped here, a prisoner in luxury. The thought made her want to scream or laugh or both. At 6 in the evening there was a knock, 3 measured taps, and when she opened the door a man stood there who looked like he had been carved from granite, his face weathered and serious, his eyes scanning the hallway behind him before settling on her with professional assessment. James Thornhill, he said, holding out a hand. I will be outside your door. Anything you need, you ask me. Do not leave without me. Do not open the door for anyone except Mr. Sinclair. Understood? Eleanor shook his hand because she did not know what else to do and nodded, and James took up position in the hallway with the stillness of someone who could wait forever without complaint. She closed the door and felt the cage lock into place. At 8, Alexander returned carrying her laptop bag in one hand and a suitcase in the other, and the sight of her belongings from her apartment made something crack in Eleanor's chest because it meant he had been inside her space, had seen the dishes in her sink and the laundry on her chair and all the small vulnerabilities of her real life. He set everything down just inside the door, and she rounded on him with all the anger she had been storing up since the alley. Who are you really? Not the careful explanation from earlier. The truth. He looked at her for a long moment, then moved to the couch and sat, gesturing to the chair across from him in silent invitation. Eleanor remained standing. I control the port district, he said, his voice even and factual. Shipping, imports, warehouses. Some of what moves through my territory is legal, some is not. I inherited the operation from my father, and I have spent the last 10 years consolidating power and eliminating anyone who could not follow a code of conduct. I do not traffic in people. I do not allow drugs that kill. I do not harm civilians. The Morettis have none of those restrictions. They see you as a tool to use against me, a way to destabilize my position during a territorial dispute. They will kill you, not because you are a threat, but because your death or capture serves their purpose. Eleanor felt her knees weaken and she sat finally, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. You are a criminal. Yes. And you expect me to just accept that? To trust you? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the intensity in his pale eyes made her breath catch. I expect you to survive. Trust is your choice. But know this. I have never lied to you. I will not start now. The air between them felt charged, electric, and Eleanor hated that even now, even knowing what he was, her pulse raced when he looked at her like that. Like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. The first day trapped in the safe house stretched like a prison sentence. every hour marked by the silence and the city sounds filtering through glass that Eleanor suspected was bulletproof, and she set up her laptop at the dining table and responded to client emails with excuses about a family emergency while her hands trembled over the keyboard. Calling Caroline was harder. Her sister answered on the second ring, voice bright with curiosity, and Eleanor forced lightness into her tone as she invented a story about a last-minute trip upstate with a friend. Hating the lie, but knowing the truth would send Caroline into a panic that could put her in danger too. The second day she actually managed to work, losing herself in a logo redesign for a boutique hotel. The familiar rhythm of creation a lifeline to normalcy. And when Alexander arrived that evening, he brought takeout from a Thai place she had mentioned liking in one of their conversations through her apartment door a lifetime ago. The fact that he remembered made something twist in her chest. They ate at the table and he asked about her day with genuine interest, and she found herself telling him about the project, about the client who could not decide between serif and sans serif fonts, and he listened like it mattered. "How did you end up doing this?" he asked, gesturing to her laptop, and she told him about art school, about the scholarship that had not quite covered everything, about dropping out after her father died, and her mother got sick, and someone had to pay the bills. His expression shifted. Something like recognition or understanding, and he told her about his own sister, younger by 4 years, who had wanted to be a dancer and had died at 16 from an illness their father had refused to treat properly because he believed doctors were a weakness. Eleanor saw the grief beneath his control, old and deep, and never fully healed. "I started doing this because she could not," Alexander said quietly. "Someone had to make sure people in our world had rules, had lines they could not cross. She would have hated what I became, but she would have understood why." The third evening he brought wine, good wine that probably cost more than her rent, and they sat on the floor by the windows watching the city lights flicker on as dusk deepened into night. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "The life you chose?" He considered the question, rolling the wine glass between his palms. "I did not choose it. I inherited it. But I have made choices within it. Some I regret. Others I would make again." He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his pale eyes made her breath catch. "Meeting you was not part of any plan I had. That text was an accident that should have been nothing. But I have not stopped thinking about it. About you." Eleanor knew she should not ask, but the wine and the intimacy of the dimly lit room loosened her caution. "What did you think?" He set down his glass and shifted closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive. "I thought about the courage it took to write those words, even by accident. I thought about what it would be like to hear you say them on purpose. I thought about whether you had any idea how beautiful you are when you are angry or scared or trying to be brave." She could not breathe, could not think. "I still think about it," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Every night you have been here." The air between them felt like a living thing, charged and dangerous. "I think about it too," Eleanor whispered, the confession escaping before she could stop it. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Can I kiss you?" She nodded because words had abandoned her, and when his mouth met hers it was slow and deliberate and devastating, a kiss that tasted like wine and promises and the edge of something that could consume them both if they let it. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and reached across the bed to find cool sheets and empty space where Alexander had been hours before, when exhaustion finally claimed her, and the absence felt like a physical thing, a hollowness in her chest that she tried to ignore as she sat up and saw the note on his pillow, in dark, angular handwriting that read, "Had to handle business. James is outside. Back tonight." And she hated how those few words made her feel like a responsibility rather than whatever last night had suggested they were becoming. She showered and dressed and tried to work, but her mind kept circling back to the kiss, to the way he had looked at her like she was something precious and dangerous all at once, to the question of whether she was falling for a man who lived in a world where people got killed over territory and insults, and she was just collateral damage in someone else's war. The day crawled past with excruciating slowness, and she checked her phone compulsively, even though he had not given her his number, beyond that first exchange, had kept that distance like he was protecting her from further entanglement, even as he pulled her deeper into his orbit. At 7 that evening, she heard voices in the hallway, Alexander's low and controlled, and James responding with clipped military efficiency. And when the door opened, Alexander stepped inside, and she knew immediately that something had changed, because tension radiated from him like heat, his jaw tight and his pale eyes storm-dark. "What happened?" she asked, standing from where she had been pretending to read on the couch. He closed the distance between them in 3 strides, and she saw something almost like fear flicker across his face before he locked it down. "There has been an incident. A Moretti soldier was found dead in neutral territory this morning. They are blaming my crew." Eleanor felt cold spread through her veins. "Did you?" she started, and he shook his head sharply. "No. But that does not matter. They will use this as justification for retaliation, and you are the easiest target. I need to move you somewhere more secure." "No," Eleanor said, and her own vehemence surprised her. "I cannot keep living like this, Alexander. Hiding and running and waiting for the next threat. This has to end." "I know," he said, and reached up to cup her face with both hands, his touch gentle despite the violence she knew those hands were capable of. "I am working on a solution. I promise you this will end. Just trust me a little longer." She wanted to pull away, to rage against the impossibility of this situation, but the intensity in his eyes pinned her in place, and she saw something beneath the control, something raw and desperate that looked almost like the fear she felt. "How can you promise that?" she whispered. "Because I will burn down everything I have built before I let them touch you," he said, and the certainty in his voice made her believe him, even though belief felt like its own kind of danger. The drive to Alexander's estate took 45 minutes through increasingly rural roads where city lights gave way to forest shadows and high stone walls that spoke of money and secrecy, and Eleanor watched the landscape change through the SUV window while James drove and Alexander sat beside her with his hand covering hers on the seat between them, his thumb tracing absent circles on her wrist that she suspected were meant to be reassuring, but only reminded her how far she was traveling from everything familiar. The gates were wrought iron and 12 feet tall, opening onto a circular drive that wrapped around a fountain where water cascaded over stone angels, and the house itself was not the cold modern fortress she had expected, but rather a sprawling estate of warm brick and tall windows that glowed golden in the darkness, beautiful in a way that made her chest ache because it looked like a home, and she had to remind herself this was temporary, just another stage of hiding until the threat passed. Alexander led her inside where marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and a curved staircase swept upward to the second floor, and 2 men waited in the entrance hall, both watching her with expressions that mingled curiosity and calculation. Robert Harcourt was Alexander's age with steel-gray eyes and the build of someone who had seen combat, his handshake firm and his smile polite but empty of warmth, and Thomas Ashford was younger, with dark skin and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a professor than whatever role he filled in Alexander's organization, though his greeting held more genuine friendliness as he told her he had prepared the East Wing guest suite for her use. Alexander showed her upstairs himself, past hallways lined with art that was probably worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. And the suite he opened was larger than her entire apartment, with a 4-poster bed and sitting area and windows that overlooked gardens she could barely see in the darkness beyond. "Get some rest," he said, but his hand lingered on her lower back, and she could feel the tension radiating through him, the fear he would not name, but that she recognized because it matched her own. She nodded and he left, and she stood alone in the beautiful room, feeling unmoored, uncertain whether she was a guest or a prisoner, or something else entirely. An hour later she could not sleep despite exhaustion, so she wandered downstairs and found her way to a terrace that stretched across the back of the house, and she was standing at the stone balustrade looking out at moonlit gardens when voices drifted through an open window to her left. Robert's tone sharp with frustration as he said, "She is a liability we cannot afford, Alexander, and you are letting your feelings compromise your judgment." The response was Alexander's voice, but colder than she had ever heard it, each word precisely enunciated and deadly calm. "You will not speak about her again in those terms. She is under my protection, and that makes her untouchable. If you have concerns about my judgment, you are welcome to leave." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable, and then Robert's quiet apology and retreating footsteps. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart hammering, until she heard the terrace door open behind her, and Alexander emerged looking worn and dangerous in equal measure. "I am sorry," he said, crossing to stand beside her, "for all of this. For dragging you into my world, and putting you in danger, and asking you to trust me when I have given you every reason not to." She surprised herself by reaching for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I do not regret meeting you." The words came out steady and true, and his expression shifted, something vulnerable breaking through his control. He turned to face her fully, cupping her face with his free hand. "You should. You should regret every moment since that text. But selfishly, I am glad you do not." He kissed her then with a desperation that tasted like fear and need and borrowed time, and she kissed him back under the stars while the fortress walls surrounded them and danger circled closer with every passing hour. Eleanor woke the next morning with restless energy thrumming through her veins and the realization that she could not simply hide in this beautiful fortress while Alexander and his men worked to dismantle the threat that existed because of her. So after breakfast, she found Thomas in what appeared to be a study lined with bookshelves and a massive desk covered in files and laptops. And when she knocked on the open door, he looked up with surprise that shifted to cautious welcome as she said, "I want to help." He exchanged a glance with Robert, who sat in a leather chair near the window, and Robert's expression made clear his opinion on that suggestion. But Thomas gestured to a chair and asked what skills she could offer, and she explained her background in graphic design, her ability to see patterns and connections in visual data, her experience organizing information in ways that made complex systems comprehensible. Thomas studied her for a long moment, then pulled out a file box filled with financial documents and surveillance photos, and said they had been trying to map the Moretti family business structure, but the connections were opaque, deliberately obscured through shell companies and intermediaries, and if she could find anything useful, she was welcome to try. Eleanor spent the next 6 hours surrounded by paper, building visual maps on Thomas's spare laptop, color-coding relationships and money flows, and it was familiar work that let her mind settle into the kind of focus she had always used to escape stress, until a pattern began to emerge that made her pulse quicken. "Thomas," she called, and he crossed the room to look over her shoulder at the screen, where she had highlighted 7 seemingly unrelated businesses that all funneled money through a single charity organization called Harbor Hope Foundation. "It is a laundering operation," she said, tracing the flow with her finger. "They take illegal profits, run them through the charity as donations, then disperse them back out as grants to businesses they control. It makes the money look legitimate and gives them tax advantages." Thomas leaned closer, his eyes scanning her work, and then he was pulling out his phone and calling Alexander, his voice tight with controlled excitement, as he said, "You need to see this." Alexander arrived 20 minutes later, still in a black suit from whatever business he had been handling, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as it always did when he entered a room, that magnetic pull that seemed to intensify rather than diminish with proximity. Thomas explained her findings, and Alexander stood behind her chair, studying the screen with one hand resting on her shoulder, his touch warm through her thin sweater. And when he finished reading, he turned to look at her with something in his expression that went beyond gratitude or attraction into territory that made her chest feel too full. "This is exactly what we need," he said quietly. "The other families will not tolerate this kind of operation because it draws federal attention they cannot afford. If we present this evidence, the Morettis will lose their alliances." Thomas was already nodding, pulling up additional files to cross-reference, and Robert had joined them, looking at Eleanor with reassessment rather than suspicion. That evening, after Thomas had taken her documentation to begin building a presentation, Alexander found her in the gardens where twilight painted everything in shades of gold and purple. And they walked in silence for several minutes before she asked the question that had been building all day. "What happens when this is over?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his pale eyes searching hers. "You go back to your life, to your apartment and your work and your sister, to safety. Is that what you want?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer, and when he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured, like he was walking through a minefield. "What I want is irrelevant. You did not choose this world, Eleanor. You should not be trapped in it because of my inability to let you go." "That is not an answer," she said. He reached up to cup her face with both hands, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew resided there. "I do not want you to leave. I want you to stay here with me, and let me spend the rest of my life ensuring you never regret that choice. But I will not ask that of you." The words hung between them, an offering and a confession, and Eleanor found she could not respond because she did not yet know her own answer. Thomas had set the meeting with the 5 families for Thursday evening at a neutral restaurant in the financial district, which gave them 3 days to prepare the presentation and verify every piece of evidence Eleanor had compiled. And the estate hummed with tense energy as Alexander's men ran security protocols and Robert coordinated with contacts to ensure safe passage, while Eleanor worked with Thomas to refine the visual documentation until it was irrefutable and damning. Wednesday night she couldn't sleep, restless with anticipation and fear about what would happen once they exposed the Morettis, whether this would truly end the threat or simply escalate it. And she had just gotten out of bed to make tea when the first window exploded inward in a shower of glass, and the sharp crack of gunfire split the night air. Her scream caught in her throat as Alexander appeared in her doorway, already moving, his hand closing around her wrist as he pulled her into the hallway where more gunfire echoed from downstairs, and she could hear shouting, James's voice barking orders, and the thunder of footsteps on marble floors. "Stay with me," Alexander said, his body shielding hers as they moved quickly toward the west wing, and she stumbled trying to match his pace while her heart slammed against her ribs, and terror made her limbs feel disconnected from her body. They reached a door she had never noticed before, hidden behind a bookcase that Alexander shoved aside with one hand, and he pressed his palm to a scanner that clicked and released with a heavy mechanical sound before he pulled her through into a narrow stairwell that descended into darkness. More gunfire above them, closer now. Alexander locked the door behind them with a code she couldn't see in the dim emergency lighting, then took her hand again and led her down 2 flights of stairs that opened into a room perhaps 12 feet square, with concrete walls and a heavy steel door that sealed behind them with a pressurized hiss. The panic room. Eleanor's breath came in short gasps that she couldn't control, and her hands shook violently as adrenaline flooded her system, and Alexander pulled her against his chest, wrapping both arms around her while he murmured something she couldn't hear over the rushing in her ears. The room was soundproofed, but not completely silent. She could feel the vibrations of violence above them, muffled thuds that might have been gunshots or footfalls or doors slamming, and she pressed closer to Alexander as if his body could shield her from reality itself. "I am sorry," he said into her hair, his voice rough with emotion she had never heard from him before. "I am so sorry for all of this, for bringing this danger to you, for not protecting you better." She pulled back enough to look at his face in the pale emergency lighting that cast shadows under his eyes and made him look almost vulnerable, despite the rigid control he maintained. "I am not sorry," she said, and the words came out fierce and certain. "I choose this. I choose you." His expression cracked, something raw and desperate breaking through, and when he kissed her it tasted like fear and need and the kind of hunger that came from standing at the edge of losing everything. She kissed him back with equal desperation, her fingers digging into his shoulders as she pulled him closer, and when he pressed her back against the concrete wall, she wrapped her legs around him, and they made love in the sealed darkness with violence echoing distantly above them, a desperate affirmation of life and choice amid death and chaos. The all-clear signal came through Alexander's phone 47 minutes after they had sealed themselves in the panic room, a coded vibration pattern that made his shoulders drop fractionally before he helped Eleanor straighten her clothes and led her back up the concrete stairs into a house transformed by violence. Two bodies lay in the entrance hall, covered with sheets that were already darkening with blood, and Eleanor forced herself not to look away, because this was the reality of the world she had chosen, the cost of loving a man whose enemies would kill without hesitation. James stood near the shattered front window with a rifle still in his hands and a cut along his jaw that dripped red onto his collar. And Robert was on his phone coordinating cleanup crews, while other men she recognized from the estate staff moved through rooms assessing damage and securing the perimeter. Alexander kept her hand in his as they walked through the destruction, his grip almost painful in its intensity, and she understood he needed the physical confirmation that she remained alive and whole beside him. The third Moretti soldier sat zip-tied to a chair in what had been a formal dining room, blood streaming from his nose and one eye already swelling shut. And when Alexander released Eleanor's hand and told James to take her upstairs, she surprised herself by saying no. She needed to see this. Needed to understand exactly what kind of man she had bound herself to in that panic room. Alexander looked at her for a long moment with something like pain in his pale eyes, before he nodded once and gestured for her to wait by the door, and Robert set up a laptop on the sideboard so she could watch through the camera feed while maintaining distance from what was about to happen. Alexander approached the captured man with the same controlled grace he brought to everything, pulling up a chair and sitting down as casually as if they were about to discuss business over coffee. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet and almost gentle, in a way that made Eleanor's skin crawl because she could hear the threat underneath like razors wrapped in silk. He did not raise his voice, did not touch the man except once to grip his face and force eye contact. But every word he spoke painted pictures of what would happen if information was not provided, detailed descriptions of pain and loss delivered with the certainty of someone who had both witnessed and inflicted such things. And Eleanor watched the soldier break in under 10 minutes, sobbing out details of the planned kidnapping, how the Morettis had intended to take her during the family meeting and hold her until Alexander surrendered his territory. Alexander's expression never changed, but his hands curled into fists where they rested on his knees. And when he finally stood and walked out of the room, his face had transformed into something carved from stone, beautiful and terrible and utterly merciless. He returned to Eleanor still wearing that expression, and she saw him register her presence as if remembering she existed, and she watched him try to smooth the violence from his features before he reached her. His hands were clean, but his shirt cuffs were spattered with drops of red that looked black in the dim lighting. She should have been horrified, should have seen this as confirmation that he was exactly as dangerous as his reputation suggested. Instead, she took his hands in hers and led him upstairs to his bedroom, into the bathroom, where she turned on the shower and began unbuttoning his ruined shirt. He stood motionless while she undressed him with careful efficiency, removing each piece of clothing until he stood naked and vulnerable before her. And then she stripped off her own clothes and pulled him under the hot water. She washed him slowly, methodically, her hands moving over his body with a tenderness that had nothing to do with arousal and everything to do with claiming every part of him, including the darkness. He never spoke. Neither did she. Alexander told her absolutely not when she insisted on attending the meeting, his voice flat and final in a way that made his men straighten and avoid eye contact. But Eleanor stood her ground in the study where they had gathered to finalize logistics and said if she was the reason for this war, then she would face the consequences alongside him. The argument lasted 20 minutes with Robert and Thomas staying carefully silent while Alexander cycled through reasons she should remain at the estate, each one centered on her safety. Until finally, she stepped close enough to touch his chest and said quietly that she needed to do this, needed to prove to herself and to his world that she was not simply a liability to be protected, but someone who could stand beside him. Something shifted in his expression then, resignation mixed with what might have been pride, and he nodded once before turning to James with instructions to triple the security detail. The meeting was set for 7 that evening at Luciano's, an old establishment in the financial district that had hosted such gatherings for 40 years under strict rules of neutrality, and Eleanor dressed carefully in a charcoal suit that Thomas had procured for her, simple and professional in a way that felt like armor. The drive into the city was tense and silent, with Alexander's hand covering hers on the seat between them, while 2 additional cars followed carrying James and 6 other men whose names she had learned over the past weeks. They arrived at 6:50 and were escorted to a private dining room on the 3rd floor, where a long table had been set with water glasses and notepads. No food or wine, because this was business, not pleasure. The other families arrived in carefully timed intervals, each patriarch accompanied by his own security and advisors. And Eleanor recognized names from the documents she had studied: Castellano and Kovac and De Luca, and finally Moretti. Vincent Moretti was 60, with silver hair and a face that might have been handsome before cruelty carved lines around his mouth, and when his eyes found Eleanor across the room, she felt the weight of his hatred like a physical thing. Alexander kept her slightly behind him as they took their seats, his body language radiating controlled violence, and the mediator, a retired federal judge named Morrison, who was paid handsomely to oversee such meetings, called the gathering to order with formal language about rules and respect. Alexander presented first, his voice calm and factual as he laid out the timeline of Moretti aggression, the attack on his estate, the attempted kidnapping plot revealed by their captured soldier, and then he distributed copies of the financial analysis Eleanor had compiled. The packets made their way around the table, and she watched old men who had built empires on violence study her charts and spreadsheets with the intensity of predators scenting weakness. Moretti denied everything, his voice rising as he called the documents forgeries and accused Alexander of manufacturing evidence to justify territorial expansion, and the room erupted in crosstalk until Morrison slammed his hand on the table for silence. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this could go either way, that these men might choose to side with Moretti out of tradition, or fear, or simply because they did not trust Alexander's word. And before she could second-guess herself, she stood and asked permission to speak. The accord was signed at 9:47 that evening, with formal language that made violence sound like contract negotiation. And by the time Eleanor and Alexander left Luciano's, the city had transformed into something unfamiliar, streets she had walked her entire life now feeling like foreign territory, because she had changed too fundamentally to fit back into the shape of her old existence. The drive to her apartment took 40 minutes through traffic that seemed designed to prolong the inevitable, and Alexander's hand remained steady on the wheel while hers twisted in her lap, neither of them speaking because words felt inadequate for whatever was happening in the space between them. He parked outside her building in a spot that would definitely earn a ticket by morning and turned to face her with an expression she could not quite read, something between relief and loss. And when he said he would walk her up, she nodded because she was not ready for goodbye, even though she knew it was coming. Her apartment smelled stale when she opened the door, air thick with weeks of absence, and the familiar space looked smaller than she remembered, shabbier, like a photograph that had faded while the original memory remained vivid and sharp. Alexander stood in her tiny living room, looking absurdly out of place in his tailored suit, this man who commanded empires reduced to awkward stillness in her 600 square feet of modest reality, and she found herself seeing the cracked tile in the kitchen and the water stain on the ceiling through his eyes, and feeling embarrassed before catching herself, because this had been enough before she knew what marble floors and security gates felt like. He told her she was safe now, that the agreement was binding, and the Morettis would face consequences from all 5 families if they violated the accord. And she heard what he was not saying, that she could return to her life without him, that the debt was paid and the protection no longer necessary. She should have felt relieved, should have thanked him for everything and closed the door on this strange interlude. Instead, she heard herself say she needed time, that everything had happened so fast and she did not know how to process any of it. And she watched his face close down into careful neutrality as he nodded and said he understood completely. He moved toward the door and she followed, her body acting without permission from her brain. And when he turned back, she was close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the control it was taking him to leave. He cupped her face with both hands, his touch gentle despite the violence those hands had done, and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made her chest ache. And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the stairs while she stood frozen in her doorway. The first day back felt like wearing someone else's skin. Familiar routines turned strange and uncomfortable, and she sat at her desk trying to work on client projects that seemed trivial compared to mapping criminal organizations. Caroline came over that evening with takeout and questions Eleanor could not fully answer, edited versions of the truth that made her sister's eyes narrow with suspicion, but also reluctant acceptance. The second day was worse, every hour dragging while she refreshed her phone compulsively and hated herself for hoping he would call first. On the third night, she lay awake at 2 in the morning, staring at her ceiling, and finally admitted what her body had known since she walked through her apartment door, that this place was no longer home, that home had become wherever Alexander was, and she reached for her phone before fear could stop her. He answered on the second ring with her name spoken like a question and a statement simultaneously, his voice rough with what might have been sleep or simply the lateness of the hour, and she told him without preamble that his offer still stood, if he still meant it, the words tumbling out before courage could abandon her. The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like hours before he said he would be there in 40 minutes. And she spent the time between packing 2 suitcases with shaking hands, pulling clothes from her closet without really seeing them, adding her laptop and hard drives and the framed photo of her parents that had sat on her desk since college. He arrived in 37 minutes, driving himself without security for once. And when she opened the door, he looked at the suitcases, and then at her face with an expression that made her chest constrict, hope and disbelief warring in his eyes, before he picked up both bags like they weighed nothing and led her to the car. The drive back to the estate felt different than every other time she had made this trip. Not an escape or a necessity, but a choice. Her hand in his on the center console while the city gave way to suburbs and then the guarded gates that opened at their approach. He carried her bags upstairs to the master suite where she had spent so many nights already, but this time, when he set them down in the walk-in closet that was larger than her entire bedroom had been, she understood this was permanence rather than temporary shelter. They did not discuss timelines or expectations that night, both of them understanding without words that some things needed to unfold naturally rather than being forced into definition. And she fell asleep in his arms with the certainty that she had made the right choice, even if she could not yet explain it to anyone, including herself. The first week was adjustment, learning to navigate the estate as a resident rather than a guest. And Alexander cleared out an unused room on the second floor that had southern exposure and helped her set up her design studio with a new desk and monitor and the kind of ergonomic chair she had always coveted but never been able to afford. She continued her freelance work, video calls with clients who had no idea she was now living in the home of the man who controlled half the city's commerce. And the routine of deadlines and revisions gave her days structure while she learned the rhythms of Alexander's world. He introduced her gradually to the legitimate side of his empire, dinners at restaurants he owned, where managers treated him with respect that bordered on reverence, a commercial real estate development that was entirely legal and surprisingly innovative, a shipping logistics company that operated in the gray space between legitimate and criminal but stayed carefully on the right side of prosecution. Robert and Thomas warmed to her slowly, their initial wariness fading as they saw she was not a temporary distraction, but something that had fundamentally altered Alexander's trajectory. And one evening over drinks, Robert told her he had never seen his boss consider consequences before she arrived. Alexander revealed his plan on a night 6 weeks after she moved in, documents spread across his study desk, outlining a 5-year transition that would move 60% of his operations into legal enterprises. And when she asked why now, he looked at her like the answer was obvious, saying he wanted to build something that would not get her killed, would not require her to lie to her sister, would not make their children targets before they were even born. The casual mention of children should have terrified her. Instead, she kissed him and said she wanted to help. The studio Alexander had helped her set up 3 months ago now felt completely hers, walls covered with mood boards for the 4 legitimate businesses she was designing branding for, her desk organized chaos that made perfect sense to her creative process, and she had just finished a logo presentation when Caroline texted asking if she could visit that afternoon. The first time her sister had requested to come to the estate rather than meeting in the city. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with nervousness as she cleaned up the guest suite and wondered what Caroline would think of this life she had chosen. But when her sister arrived at 3 in the afternoon and Alexander greeted her with careful courtesy, Caroline surprised them both by hugging him and saying she appreciated how happy Eleanor looked these days. The visit went better than Eleanor had dared hope, her sister exploring the estate with open curiosity rather than judgment, asking Alexander direct questions about his businesses that he answered with edited but honest responses. And by the time Caroline left 2 hours later, she pulled Eleanor aside and whispered that she approved, that any man who looked at her sister the way Alexander did was worth the complications. That evening, Alexander proposed an idea that had been forming for weeks, a dinner at the estate with both their families, his aging mother who lived in Connecticut and rarely visited the city, Caroline and her husband, even Robert and Thomas, who had become something like family through blood and loyalty, if not genetics. Eleanor agreed despite her nerves, because she wanted these worlds to blend rather than remain separate, wanted the people she loved to see what she saw in this man who had rebuilt his life around her presence. The dinner happened on a Saturday, 10 weeks later, with catering from the Italian restaurant Alexander owned, and wine from his personal collection that probably cost more than Eleanor used to make in a month, and watching her sister laugh at something Thomas said while Alexander's mother asked about her design work with genuine interest, she felt something settle in her chest that she had not realized was unsettled. The evening stretched long with dessert and coffee, conversations flowing easily after initial awkwardness faded, and by the time everyone left near 11, Alexander looked more relaxed than she had seen him in weeks, the tension he carried in his shoulders finally released. He took her hand without speaking and led her through the house to the terrace where they had first kissed under stars, where he had held her and promised to end the war that had trapped them together. And when he stopped at the railing overlooking the city, lights stretched below like scattered diamonds, she knew before he moved what was coming. He turned to face her and lowered himself to one knee with a grace that should have been impossible for a man his size, pulling a small black box from his jacket pocket. And before he could speak, she felt tears already forming because her body understood before her mind caught up. He said he knew it was fast, that they had only known each other 5 months, and most people would call them crazy. But she was the only certainty he had ever wanted in a life built on calculated risks and controlled chaos. And he was asking if she would marry him, build something permanent with him, take his name and his protection and everything he had to offer. The ring was platinum with a single diamond that caught the light and threw it back in fractured rainbows, beautiful and elegant without being ostentatious, exactly what she would have chosen herself. She said yes before he finished asking, the word tumbling out on a laugh that was half sob, and he stood and slid the ring onto her finger before kissing her with a tenderness that still surprised her after everything. His hands framing her face like she was something